Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye, an auditorium of audacity. I'm your host, DJ BJ Turnov, representing Z-Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio. You know by now that we look at all topics from politics to paranormal and everything in between. We're not afraid to dive into the weird stuff. Nothing is off limits here. And when we do look at legends, mysteries, the unexplained, what we're really just trying to do is peel back its layers and hopefully get somewhere near that kernel of truth. Tonight's episode and topic is no different and is the perfect microcosm of what we do here. We're looking at the infamous crystal skulls. In the late 19th century, about a dozen or so of these rock crystal skulls mysteriously made their way into museums and onto the collections scene. Now, the so-called discoverers and sellers of these skulls claimed that they were of ancient Mesoamerican origin, thousands, if not tens of thousands of years old, and some even imbued with supernatural powers. They've been linked to healing and psychic phenomena, to connecting Mesoamerican cultures like the Aztec and the Mayans to Atlantis, extraterrestrials, and even Doomsday 2012. Despite these claims, no one has shown these crystal skulls in full mystical action. Hell, we don't even really know where they came from. To fill in the gaps, we're bringing on Dr. Jane MacLaren Walsh, retired anthropologist, internationally recognized authority on crystal skulls, and formerly of Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. We also have her writing partner, Brett Topping, writer for over 3 decades. 2 notable career stops for Brett were editor at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress and director of publications for the National Museum of Women in the Arts. Dr. Walsh and Brett, they're going to explore the real origins and mythology of the crystal skulls. They're going to tell us how the murky world of 19th century archaeological collecting was able to produce a legend within a legend. We're going to find out about the man who invented the Aztec crystal skulls back in a Mind's Eye moment. You're listening to The Mind's Eye on Stitcher Radio and Z-Talk Radio. Before we talk about the mystery of the Aztec crystal skulls, let's quickly examine another obscurity from antiquity. There are these prehistoric stone balls found all across East Africa and Eurasia, and their purpose is a bit perplexing. An international team of archaeologists think that they've unlocked the answer after analyzing stone balls found in a modern-day Israeli cave. Combined with evidence around the cave, the team believes that the balls were used to break the bones of large animals to retrieve the marrow. That seems to kind of fall under the keep it simple, stupid notion. Essentially, it was just an early butchering tool that ultimately ended up aiding in our development. You can always find fascinating news articles like this on our Facebook and Twitter pages at Mind's Eye Show or at our website, themindseyemedia.com. We also got more detailed information about our guest tonight, Dr. Walsh and Brett Topping. They're going to give the final word on the Aztec crystal skulls, paranormal artifact, or archaeological invention. The Mind's Eye will be right back after this commercial break. The Mind's Eye is now joined by Dr. Walsh and Brett Topping. They're going to fix history and discuss the man who invented Aztec crystal skulls. Thank you, both of you, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, my pleasure. Let's start with Dr. Walsh. I know you're retired now, but you were an anthropologist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Just in your profession, and I imagine you probably got a chance to look through the archives. Did you find anything pretty interesting or something surprised you during your search?
Oh, gosh.
I know I put you right on the spot, right? First question, right?
Yes. Years ago, I worked on one of the earliest collections that kind of formed the sort of base of the Smithsonian's collections that were made by the United States Exploring Expedition, and they circumnavigated the globe in the 1830s and collected artifacts and fishes and birds and shells and rocks and plants from all over the world. And When the Smithsonian was founded in 1846, all of those collections kind of came into the museum. So I was tasked with trying to locate the things that were held in the anthropology department, which turned out to be some really extraordinary things that nobody had looked at for 100 years. So that was one sort of big surprise after another.
I'm sure you've heard this as someone who's worked at this, for the Smithsonian, is that, the Smithsonian is always covering up, strange and weird anomalies in human history. And, it's giant skeleton bones across the states, the discovery of hidden caves near Grand Canyon filled with Egyptian artifacts. And, Doctor, I'm going to assume you haven't seen any of those, but, how do you respond when you hear something like that?
Having worked for the institution for 4 decades, I got plenty of letters like that that we were required to answer. Mostly you just have to reassure people that they're myths and kind of stories that have circulated that have no real basis in truth or history. Sometimes people don't believe you. We've all encountered letters from people who have found stones that they think have secret carvings or an unknown language written on them, and they turn out to be basically just rocks, or river pebbles that have been marked in different ways. But so a lot of times, we will write a letter saying, well, actually, no, I think it's just a river stone. And then that person will send back a letter with photographs of 26 more. Well, yeah, but what about these? So,
well, let's not double down. Let's 26 down there. Jeez.
Yeah. And then occasionally they would send me boxes of the actual rocks, but the hard to convince ones.
Okay, and I guess they weren't imbued with any special powers that was emanating off. No, okay, fair enough. I don't know why, but in my mind, I feel like Indiana Jones definitely had an effect on me. I always seen like the Smithsonian archives in my mind as just like zooming out in that last scene, and it's just a million artifacts all locked up, and I don't know why. That's just what I get in my mind. But Brett, you're an outsider in the sense that you didn't work for the Smithsonian straightforwardly, so you really have no dog in the fight, so to speak. Why do you think people? Why do you think people say those type of things?
Well, I think that there's a real wonderment and mystery to what you can imagine an institution like the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress, where I did work. When you think about the extent of the collections, it's kind of mind-boggling, the millions and hundreds of millions of objects in each category. So it's easy to kind of imagine that there must be something really bizarre and exotic there. And certainly there are bizarre and exotic things, but they aren't extraterrestrial or anything else, really. They're just the wonders of nature and the wonders of human creativity and all of that. Those are really all in the collections. And there are all kinds of marvelous discoveries to be made that aren't, something really from another planet or anything else. They're just the amazing things that humans have created and the amazing things of nature. So it's kind of true that there are lots of discoveries to be made. And, Jane has spent her career looking at artifacts that have been collected and finding really a lot of interesting things about them. Whereas a lot of curators just want to collect more things. But, there's so much to find out just from one object in the collections of the Smithsonian, that it's just amazing.
Well, since Brett is going to put you on the spot there, I'm going to magnify that for a little bit. Dr. Walsh, in your research, I mean, have you seen anything that's kind of made you look twice or say, that kind of changed history just even a little bit?
We used to keep the collections in the attic of the Natural History Museum. And you could go up into the attic and open up cabinets and pull open drawers and basically just, delve into the collections. I did my undergraduate and master's degree work in Mexico and studied Mexican archaeology. And when I first got to the museum, I was surprised that there were artifacts that to me looked like they were fakes. And I couldn't understand how somebody might have been fooled by them because to me they looked pretty obvious. But what I came to realize was that in the 19th century, when museums were first starting to be founded and people were trying to build collections, a lot of people didn't really know what they were looking for. Mexico in particular was closed to the outside world by Spain for about 300 years. And when it was open and people got to see, ancient artifacts, they wanted to collect them, as many as they could. Well, as is well known, you create a demand, someone else will create a supply. So the 19th century was this century of people creating ancient, quote-unquote, artifacts. So when the crystal skull kind of arrived in the museum, in the mail, actually, it kind of fit into some ideas I had already started forming.
We're going to slide right into the book over here with the man who invented Aztec crystal skulls, and that's obviously what surprised you about history. And so this crystal skull, it comes into the Smithsonian, and then weren't you approached by a colleague also?
It was addressed to the Mesoamerican Museum, which doesn't exist in the Smithsonian, so it was delivered to the Museum of American History. And Richard Alborn, who was a curator there many years ago, he called me up one day and said that he had gotten this crystal skull in the mail and he didn't know what to do with it. So I said, I'll take it, because I knew the British Museum had a crystal skull that was very famous, and the Musée de l'Homme in Paris also I knew had one. So I thought, well, great, we'll get one too. So that basically is when it started.
So then, it sounds like there's a bit of a mystery, and you kind of were uncovering some stuff about the Aztec crystal skulls, and you decided to maybe I think you were writing a paper about it, and turns into this book.
Yep.
And of course, you got your writing partner over there. We got Brett. So when Dr. Walsh approached you for the project, I mean, what were your initial thoughts? He says, I want to write about the Aztec crystal skull, and I'm sure you've heard that, all about the supernatural powers and all that, stuff that goes with it. I mean, what were your initial thoughts, and then also how did you two originally connect for the book?
Well, I was kind of interested. I was interested in the crystal skulls because the first time I ever heard about them was years ago in the comic papers in D.C. in the weekends on Sunday. They would have comics, and there was always a Believe It or Not section in the comics. This kind of dates me, I think. But anyway, and they had at one point an Aztec crystal skull. as the Believe It or Not. And the story about it was that it was thousands of years old, and it had taken thousands of years for them to polish perfectly this crystal skull into like this amazing thing that had been passed down through history in the Aztec world. And I, like everybody else, it was like, wow, and these people spent all of their lives and for many generations polishing a crystal skull because they didn't have any real tools to, or contemporary tools to work it. So that was an interesting thing to me when Jane started talking about the crystal skulls, that it was a connection to this earlier amazement that I had had. But then I became pretty interested in Eugène Boban, who was really the person behind the main personality of the story, because it quickly became evident that they weren't what they purported to be. And this man had this very interesting life and career. So that really became more of the focus of it after Jane's initial investigation of whether the skulls were old and whether they were Aztec, So that was what drew me mostly to the story, was the story of this man's life and activities.
And all of a sudden, in the 1800s, these crystal skulls that are attributed to the Aztecs come onto the scene. Brett, yes. Tell us what you've seen. Describe what these kind of crystal skulls look like, and talk about how they, came when they arrived on the scene and that kind of time.
Well, they varied in size from being about the size of a walnut, and they look like a real skull. They have empty eye sockets, and they have the temples are slightly concave, and the teeth, of a skull, and jaw, and they definitely look like a skull. They're very recognizable. Some of them are about the size of a walnut, and then some of them are a tiny bit bigger than that. And two of them, the one in Paris at the Quai Branly now museum, is a little smaller than life size, but like about a grapefruit size. And the one at the British Museum is almost life size. And they have a lovely they're very clear. They're like water. They're so clear. And they just have a great appeal to them because they're kind of eerie and they're kind of morbid, and they apparently were made by ancient cultures spending thousands of years polishing them. And so these started appearing in the 1860s. They most of the skulls, the crystal skulls that Jane was studying, appeared in a 30-year period between the 1860s and 1890s in private collections, and then as museums were formed, they moved into museum collections. And, there are these pretty amazing-looking things that have a lot of appeal to them.
And how were you able to trace back these fake skulls back to Boban?
Well, so the first thing I did when I decided to try and do some research on the skull was to write to the British Museum and to the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, because I knew they both had a crystal skull. So as I got some really great informative letters back, and it turned out that they not only had one crystal skull, but they had two each. And not immediately, but fairly soon after hearing from both curators, it turned out that at least 3 of the 4 skulls were all sold by the same person, who turned out to be Eugène Boban, which kind of set off a few
a couple red flags.
Yes, yeah. And the whole thing about whenever the crystal skull, particularly the British Museum one, whenever it's been published, it was always described as how amazing that people who only had stone tools could have created something like this. Well, yeah, it's so amazing. It's kind of too good to be true, which in fact it is too good to be true.
Tell us a little bit about him and a little bit of life story and just kind of your initial thought. I mean, obviously your initial thoughts were probably going to be like he's a fake, but it wasn't really that easy. Tell us about him and your thoughts about him.
Well, my first introduction to him was in connection with my trying to find out about crystal skulls so I could write about the one that had kind of landed on my doorstep. So, I realized that he had sold these things to 2 of the largest and most important museums in Europe in the 19th century that we later, in a kind of joint study with the British Museum, determined were made with modern tools and couldn't possibly have been Aztec. I got interested through a number of French archivists and archaeologists into looking at his career aside from the crystal skulls. And he turns out to be a really kind of amazing person who was one of 5 children to parents who were not very well off. When he was 19, he left Paris and went to California in search of gold and making a fortune. He spent 4 years there and then eventually went to Mexico, where he had learned Spanish living in California. And in Mexico, he started studying history and archaeology, and he learned the language of the Aztecs, which was Nahuatl, and became pretty proficient in it. And he made these huge collections and really was a completely self-taught expert who, in fact, despite the fact that he sold these things that were not what he said they were, he knew quite a bit, and more than most Europeans at the time, about Mexican history and archaeology. So he's like this completely self-invented person. And Brett was always kind of advising me that I was too hard on him, He's basically this really interesting guy who's making a living, and he doesn't have the luxury of being completely truthful and honest, and he tells people stories about the things he has, maybe to get a better price or to sell it. So I started trying to look at him with a more kind of accepting of his idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, he was really an interesting person, almost a dichotomist. I mean, on one level, he was a lover of history. He respected archaeology, antiquities, yet sold fakes and different type of things that appended history, and made fake history. Yeah. So, but he was, it was really interesting. I mean, and the reason why the museums were purchasing the crystal skulls from him is because he was a well-respected, he was considered a well-respected authority, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yes. And, he did quite a lot of really good things. He just had a few little
slips from
sins.
time. Yeah.
And Brett, you said it was possibly money. I mean, to me, it could possibly be. I mean, some other possible reasons. I mean, do you think that maybe he was just trying? Well, one reason why he would sell the fakes was because, I mean, he fooled a lot of different people, and some of the reason why he sold those fakes is because he was kind of giving a middle finger to them. Do you think that was the reason why he was just trying to give people, hey, F you, let me make some money, and if you don't know the history, you don't know the history?
Well, actually, the vast majority of what he sold were very legitimate objects and important objects that he put a lot of love and attention into. And there are very few of all of the thousands of things that he collected and sold that fall into the fake category. But, and they're not really fakes because they're inventions of his. He just said they were Aztec, but the Aztecs had never created crystal skulls. So it's not really a fake crystal skull. It's like he attributed it to, he took objects that already existed and he gave them a new identity. But I think that you're right, partly. I think that it was partly because of having a tight money situation from time to time. The one that ended up in the French collection at the Cape Ronley started off in Paris in the early 80s in his shop, displayed as just a beautiful piece of lapidary art. And then little by little, over the years, it kind of went more towards the Aztec end because he hadn't been able to sell it, and you can't carry inventory forever, and he'd probably paid a bit of money for it wherever he got it. And so it wasn't like he just went for that immediately, but if people wanted to fool themselves and they would buy it if it was Aztec and they wouldn't buy it if it was just a beautiful art object, hey, And I think also he probably had to have resented the fact that he knew more than a lot of the scholars of the day who were paid to be directors of museums and paid to have different positions, and he was always having to scramble to make a living, So, and Jane reminded me that it's not the French Museum skull that I'm talking about, it's the British Museum skull that started off as just a beautiful piece of lapidary art and ended up being associated with the Aztecs. But he would never say this was an Aztec piece. He would have it in a catalog and talk about how the Aztecs revered skulls and had the iconography of skulls so prominently in their lives, which they did, but not crystal skulls. And then he'd let people make the assumption that this crystal skull must be Aztec. He was pretty adroit at palming things off.
Yeah, I think there was some element also of his kind of taking some glee in pulling the wool over, the great experts who in Europe, most of the people he dealt with were fairly well off, people who had gone to university and had advanced degrees. And here he was, the only son of a poor family who had pretty much made it on his own. And, in reality knew more than the people he was dealing with. So I think he might have taken some measure of glee in fooling them.
Yeah, but he also had a kind of lively sense of humor. So, Jane, you should tell the story about, going into the cave. you know.
Yeah.
Please do.
What?
Yeah.
She's telling you. She's putting you on the spot. You got to tell the story about the cave.
Well, when he was fairly young in Mexico, he got there in his early 20s. He actually, one of the reasons he went to California was he was basically dodging the draft because at 20 he would have had to have registered and would have been drafted into Napoleon III's army. So he and his father left after his 19th birthday to go to California. But anyway, in his early 20s, he went to an Indian village outside of Mexico City and went down into a cavern. And the people in the village had said to him, "Oh, no, it's very dangerous. You shouldn't go down there." An Englishman went there and never came out. And, there was all this stuff. So he went down into the cave and he found various bones and animal bones. And he said he could hear people calling, "Are you all right? Are you there? Are you dead?" He said, "I took some pleasure in not answering them and letting them worry about them." So eventually he says that he came back out of the cave, but before he left his calling card to show that he'd been there. And everybody was very happy to see him. But there's a certain element of drama that he's always kind of creating around his exploits and his collections. So he's definitely a salesman.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like he wanted to stick out a bit, which I think also could explain the crystal skulls. It's like, hey, that's also like kind of his calling card historically too. It seems like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was please.
Kind of said so, towards the end of his life. To a newspaper man, he basically said there are all of these crystal skulls in all these important museums, and they're all fake.
Brett, how were they made? Did Boban actually make them, or did he hire somebody to make these?
Well, by and large, Jane's research has pretty much determined that a lot of them were really Catholic reliquaries, were not Catholic reliquaries, but were from Catholic objects of devotion. And the smaller ones, almost all of which, if not all of which, have a drill hole going vertically through the top of the skull to the bottom, were originally suspended from rosary beads at the bottom of the cross, and then there'd be this small crystal skull. And the larger ones, which have also are drilled like that, may have had a crucifix may have been a support for a crucifix. So they were originally Catholic objects, and Boban tried to sell them as beautiful pieces of lapidary art or whatever, and eventually found that giving them an Aztec attribution worked better. So he kind of repurposed them as Aztec, and probably had acquired them, a large number of them at least, in Mexico, because in the years he was there, the Mexican government was dissolving the Catholic institutions and tearing down churches and monasteries and selling the contents. And so there was a lot of Catholic art on the market in those years.
Would there have been any legal punishments for Boban if he was caught?
I don't think there would have been legal punishment, but his career would have been very badly impacted. So,
well, the thing is, a number of people have commented that why would he kind of risk his reputation? Because early on, when I first started writing about him, people said, "Oh, well, he must not have known." Because why would he risk his reputation? But he did know, and he made that clear and to the newspaper in 1900, talking about the fact that they were all fakes. But the other thing was that he was utterly confident that whatever he said about anything from Mexico, people would take as absolute fact. So, in fact, he wasn't risking his reputation at all because he knew nobody would question him.
He didn't think about the long-term consequence of that historic?
Well, that's what I think that his kind of coming clean to the newspaper reporter in 1900, where he says they're fakes. He doesn't mention the fact that he's the one who sold them all. But it's kind of like he's clearing it up for posterity. You know, it's like he wants people to know that he knew, that he wasn't fooled. You know, and the kind of corollary to that is, and yet he fooled everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seemed like he wanted to get caught. He was a pretty brazen guy. I mean, two examples from the book that kind of stick out in my mind was one, before you mentioned that sales catalog informed his clients on how to recognize fakes, which kind of like backhandedly guaranteed his artifacts as authentic. And then you also had a picture of Eugene standing in front of his collection that I think he was either it was his collection or he was selling. And then on the bottom left shelf, there's like a decorated human skull that has been most likely reconfigured by him. So it makes it makes you think. I mean, what else is he faking? I mean, were you able to prove that he faked anything else outside of the crystal skulls, or was that just kind of his one thing that he wanted to stick out for?
Not so much faking, but kind of repurposing, like Brett just saying something. He sold this obsidian plaque that he said commemorated the construction of the major pyramid in Tenochtitlan in the Valley of Mexico. But he initially said that he found it in Teotihuacan, which is an archaeological site about 40 miles to the north of Mexico City and was abandoned like 600 years before the Aztecs even got there. So it's like completely impossible. The people of Teotihuacan worked with a lot of obsidian and were great fakers. And in the 19th century, there were markets all over that area that were selling faked pre-Columbian objects. So, I mean, I know he must have known what these things were because his stories change over time.
So in what type of light should we look at him? What do you think?
I think in a good light. But I think what the good he did outweighed the fakes that he supplied a few museums. Because he did make several really important collections, and he put together for the French the most important collection of pre-Columbian and post-contact manuscripts, which are still in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and can be, seen by anybody who wants to see them. So he did a lot of good, but he kind of muddied the waters in a few places, which makes him to us all the more interesting.
Well, you're helping clear those muddied waters, and Brett, you agree with that sentiment as well?
Yeah, I've always been a big fan, because he went from 0 to 60. He really started at a low place on the social scale in France and made huge contributions to the field of pre-Columbian archaeology and to the study of early man, and was highly respected, and it was all by his own efforts and his own abilities and his own insights. And, so I don't know, it's almost like he may have foreseen that he wasn't going to be able to, his reputation would fade, because even though he made all these contributions, a lot of people who study the pre-Columbian era don't know about him, and who study pre-Columbian archaeology, so that his name has been resurrected because of the skulls. But it's really a very minor part of his whole story, the skulls. But yet he's come back to life as a result. So, yeah, I think he did a lot. And he was really an amazing, active, and very erudite person.
Not to mention charming.
And not to mention charming and handsome.
That definitely always goes a long way, no doubt about that.
Yeah,
I can't speak to any of that, but I would imagine for sure. If someone wanted to check out, a crystal skull, there's still a couple places they're on display, right? Paris and a couple other places?
Yes, British Museum. The Smithsonian exhibited our skull, which actually didn't have anything to do with Boban. It turned out that when we did a number of studies on it in the British Museum and in our museum, and Margaret Sachs of the British Museum determined that it had been polished using a technique that was not known or available until after World War II. So the person who donated it to the museum said that he had bought it in Mexico in 1960, and it's probable that it was made not too long before that. So that's the one crystal skull in a museum that we can't tie to Boban at all. But it's oddly, it's sort of what started this whole journey.
Adventure.
What do you got coming up? What's your eye to the future?
We're working on trying to reconstruct another 19th century collection that's wound up in the National Museum in Mexico, but also partially wound up in Boban's hands. And he kind of sold pieces of it to a number of museums. So we're trying to kind of recreate that.
Interesting. You guys are like you're Boban fanatics. What do they call those? Bobanics? What's the name that you got for you two?
Bobonics.
Oh, yeah, that's it. I like it. That's the one right there. Well, we really appreciate setting the record straight on Eugène Boban and the Aztec crystal skulls, and you can't get it any more straight from Bobonics as well. So it's we really appreciate your time. This again, big digital applause for our guest, Dr. Walsh. Brett Topping, talking about the man who invented Aztec crystal skulls. Dr. Brett, thank you so much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. Mind's Eye Wrap-Up coming next. This is the Mind's Eye Wrap-Up. Hopefully I really don't see any comments saying that, we hate the paranormal just because I made a few jokes earlier. Go look at the archives, do your homework. You'll see that we're actually pretty quite open to the unexplained and the unknown here. But we also always call a spade on this one. It really does seem nothing more. The Aztec crystal skulls are really just pure historical invention. On the next episode, we're doubling down on that perspective on an even more divisive artifact, the Shroud of Turin. Is it Jesus's burial cloak or just a holy hoax? Art historian and medieval scholar Dr. Gary Vacan unravels the mystery on the world's most controversial relic. Until then, be well and let well be. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for the Mind's Eye on Z Talk and Stitcher Radio.